This video covers expected announcements arriving on the Canon R5 Mark II, the latest rumors, new capabilities, and expected announcement and release dates. But first, I wanted to take a trip down memory lane looking at the first 5 series DSLR and how each edition has improved upon the last, leading all the way up to the R5 Mark II. Maybe you want to jump right to the R5 Mark II, or maybe you want to go back and look at the 5D2 and then the 5D Mark IV. Go ahead and use the chapters down below and you can watch what segments you want in the order you want to watch them. The Canon 5D, the 5D Mark I, or the 5D Classic as it's known, was released in October of 2005 at a retail price of $32.99. Now, using an average inflation rate of 1.8% today, that puts it at just under $4,500 US, an awful lot of money. However, if you shop on eBay or Kijiji, you can find this camera used for a staggering price of $200 or less. And $200 is a bargain. You're getting a full-frame DSLR camera for under $200, uncropped, and it's a stills-only camera. So for those of you looking for a camera that doesn't shoot video, that shoots stills only, you can't go wrong at $200. However, there are some limitations. It shoots 3 frames per second for a maximum burst of 17 frames, and has an ISO range of 100 to 1600 ISO, although that is expandable. It has 9 autofocus points, but these are contrast detect. We're several years away before we got that dual pixel autofocus system, which does come in the 5D Mark IV. And you should really consider this camera if you're looking at getting into photography. You want to get a good camera, a full frame camera, and you don't want to have to pay an awful lot of money at around $200 or less. I mean, it's a rounding error for most modern cameras. Even your tax rate on most modern cameras is going to well exceed $200. So you can focus your investment on lenses alone. And while the 5D Classic uses the EF mount, all those EF lenses, the L series lenses for the 5D Classic, can easily be adapted to all the modern cameras such as the R5, the R6, the EOS R, and so on, including Canon's new camera to be coming out relatively soon. The new flagship camera, the R1, will support all L series glass with the adapter, and that adapter only costs $99. And while 12.8 megapixels isn't an awful lot, you're going to have finer detail because you're not dealing with these high megapixel sensors like on the R5 at 45 megapixels. 12.8 megapixels is more than enough to still do wedding and event work, and is perfect for somebody who's looking at getting into photography, so really consider this camera. The 5D Classic was capable of 100,000 shots, although many went way past that. It has the old vertical menu system, and in terms of card slots, you had CFast, no CF Express, CFast. It's the 5D Mark II that a lot of people talked about. This was the camera that they got started in YouTube. This was when YouTube was coming of age. The 5D Mark II was the first full-frame camera to offer 1080p video at 24, 25, and 30 frames per second. And while there's no autofocus system, it did provide HDMI out, and it's a relatively sturdy body. It's weather sealed, it's weather resistant, and it became a de facto camera and priced at $26.99. $26.99, that works out to be about $34.64 in today's money. That's with a 1.8% inflation. What other cameras cost around that price today? The Sony a7S III at around $32.99. And then of course we have the Canon R5 at $38.99. But it really did shake the world, and it became one of the top selling cameras, propelling Canon to the top in terms of video, and Canon became a leader in 1080p video for that time. It had an ISO range of 100 to 6400. Although if you did use the contrast detect autofocus system, it dropped the range down to 100 to 3200. And frame rates, it had a frame rate of 3.9 frames per second. It included a 3-inch LCD, which was fixed in place, no flippy screen back then, and it didn't have any features such as focus peaking, and focus peaking is very, very important for this camera. And you can add it by using Magic Lantern, which doesn't cost anything. But the reason why focus peaking is important is, well, the autofocus system on the 5D Mark II wasn't very accurate. Most of the times you're either shooting with a single point autofocus or you were shooting manually. In fact, for anybody shooting video, you were pretty well shooting like a Panasonic. You're using manual mode only because the contrast detect autofocus system in the 5D Mark II just wasn't reliable. Released in March 2012, the 5D Mark III was a minor improvement over the 5D Mark II. The 5D Mark III had a 22.3 megapixel sensor, a slight upgrade from the 21 megapixel sensor in the 5D Mark II. Well, despite being a minor upgrade, it got a big upgrade in price, reversing from that $2,600 price cut back up to $3,499. In today's money, using a 1.8% inflation rate, we're looking at just under $4,200. It's pretty pricey. So what did we get besides a 23 megapixel sensor? Well, it did get a new image processor and the ISO range up to 2500/600, which was expandable up to 102,400. In terms of frame rates, we did get a bump up to 6 frames per second, and it does have a 3.2-inch LCD. This camera is also weather sealed, and it got an improvement over weather sealing from the 5D Mark II. Dual card slots, CFast card, and an SD card, although most people turned off dual recording because if you're shooting high speed, the camera would limit the speed to the slowest card in the system, which was an SD card slot. We also got a headphone jack, and the number of shots that could be shot from this camera, well, the shutter was rated at 150,000 shots, so a definite improvement there. As far as video goes, we did get an improvement up to 60 frames per second, but that was in 720, and still no continuous tracking in video modes. That would have to wait until the 5D Mark IV. The Canon 5D Mark IV was released in September 2016 for a price of $34.99. In today's money, that's just under $3,900 or $38.99, the same price as the Canon EOS R5. I almost considered purchasing this camera back a couple years ago before the R5 was announced, but in the end I decided that the video features hadn't aged very well and weren't that very good in the modern age back in 2020. It could do 4K DCI, which was huge at 24, 25, and 30 frames per second. It could do 120 frames per second video as well, but that was in 720. And again, the 4K DCI was with a 1.74 times crop. It could shoot 60 frames per second in 1080, and this camera actually came out with dual pixel autofocus. This was huge. You could now do continuous tracking in video and stills. And on the still side of things, the camera came with 41 cross-type autofocus points, so a definite improvement over the previous camera. So we could now rely on the autofocus a whole lot more than we could on the 5D Mark III, Mark II, or the 5D Classic. To support that 4K DCI, the 5D Mark IV came with 30.1 megapixel sensor, a new image processor, greater dynamic range, greater ISO response, and capable of shooting at 7 frames per second. It had an improved shutter count going all the way up to 150,000 shots, although cameras would go well past this. However, if you're looking at buying a used one, make sure you check the shutter count before purchasing or before at least making an offer. And of course, like all other 5 series, it did have an improvement in weather sealing. Some other things that I failed to mention: headphone jack, oh yes, dual card slots as well, CFast, and an SD card slot. Many expected Canon to release a follow-up to the 5D Mark IV in the 5D Mark V, their last DSLR in the series. And while there were plans to come out with this camera as well as a 7D Mark III, Canon killed those DSLRs and instead released the Canon R5 in July of 2020. This camera effectively leapfrogged the competition. Much like Canon led video in 1080, Canon is leading video in 8K. The Canon R5 can shoot 8K video raw at 24, 25, and 30 frames per second in Canon Log 1 and Canon Log 3. It can also shoot up to 120 frames per second in 4K, do 4K 60, do 120 frames per second in 1080, and can dual record to both card slots. It has a 45 megapixel sensor and was released at a price of $38.99. An awful lot of money, definitely, but when you look at the price of the 5D Classic all the way up to 5D Mark IV, it's kind of mid-price between those cameras. It's not the most expensive, but it's certainly not the most cheap, or not the cheapest like the 5D Mark II. But it is a huge improvement. It literally leapfrogs the 5D Mark IV and pretty well every other camera out there. Not only could it do 8K raw video up to 30 frames per second, but it had a 45 megapixel sensor. And while this wasn't a stacked BSI sensor, it was fast enough that the rolling shutter in 8K video wasn't that significant. And in terms of frame rates, well, it had the same processor as the 1DX Mark III, and it could shoot at 20 frames per second electronic or 12 frames per second mechanical. And the ISO range, 100 to 102,400 extended. Excellent dynamic range, much greater improvement over the 5D Mark IV, especially if you're shooting video, Canon Log 3, the range that Canon Log 3 provides is absolutely incredible, providing you with much better protection of the shadows, highlights, and midtones. And the shutter has an expected life of 500,000. That's 5 times what the 5D Classic was at 100,000 units. CF Express card and a UHS 2 card slot, although many did hope to see dual CF Express cards. But from what we've seen from Canon, that's not going to happen in this camera and likely won't happen in the R5 Mark II because, well, that's what Canon sees as a segmentation or crippling between the 5 series and the 1 series. And even the R series, which just recently came out, the R3, had 1 CF Express card slot and 1 UHS 2 card slot. Other features. The 4K mode of the R5 also provided 8K oversampled 4K. It currently produces the highest detail 4K video of any stills hybrid camera out there, even beating out the Sony a7S III. But shooting in regular 4K, which doesn't overheat, the Sony a7S III clearly beats it there. Other things, what have I missed out here? Improved weather sealing, of course, weather sealing, headphone jack, mentioned that. A 3.2-inch LCD, but this time around, it's fully articulating. And well, that sums it up for, actually no, there's one other thing I want to mention too, and that's the autofocus system. It came out with dual pixel 2, but with recent firmware updates, we got a much greater impact on the autofocus performance. It can do human, bird, and animal eye detection. It can also do vehicle detection. And if you're shooting motorsports, it will actually lock on to the head of the person driving the vehicle, or if they're wearing a helmet, it'll lock onto the helmet. So the autofocus system is dramatically improved over the 5D Mark IV, 5D Mark III, 5D Mark II. Not only is it a continuous autofocus system, a dual pixel autofocus system, but it's much more accurate, and that's a really, really big deal about this camera. The Canon R5 Mark II will be the successor to the R5, and we can expect this camera to be announced and released in 2024. Now, many of you have asked me, well, what about 2022? What about a development announcement this year? Shouldn't we get this camera before the R1? And no, if you go back to the 5D Classic, the 5D2, and you look at the release dates, we have 2005, 2008, 2012, 2016, 2020. Almost every time we've had a succession in a 5 series, it's been right around that 4-year mark. So I don't see any difference in the R5 Mark II. I do believe that it's going to come out in 2024, and I believe that it's going to be a minor update over the R5, much like the Fuji X-T4 was a minor update over the X-T3, but it's definitely going to address those thermals. The thermal architecture in the R5 was absolutely terrible, and while the firmware update 1.1.1 did provide some improvements, there's a lot of improvements that can be made, and all they need to do is simple things such as heat pipes, move things around a little bit, and the R5 at room temperature, I'm talking about 22 degrees Celsius or around 72 degrees Fahrenheit, can easily shoot 8K raw without overheating, 4K 30 frames per second, 8K oversampled, 4K no problem without overheating. It's been done, it's been tested. So I'm hoping for better thermals. Will Canon do that? Well, they're definitely going to improve upon it, but are they going to give us unlimited recording? Yeah, we'll just have to wait and see about that. Now, in terms of the sensor, I do believe they're going to bump up the sensor to around 50 megapixels, and I think they're going to give us the exact same sensor that comes in the Canon EOS R1. I don't think the R1 is going to push much past 50 megapixels. It doesn't really make any sense, not for that camera. I think 50 megapixels is about as far as Canon wants to push it. If they still want to maintain something like 20 to 30 frames per second lossless, and even if you could do, let's say, 65 frames per second lossless, CF Express cards currently today can't handle that bandwidth. Look at the Nikon Z9. 1.2 gigabytes per second is 20 frames per second lossless at 45.7 megapixels. But still, the R5 Mark II at 50 megapixels, that's significant. That will give us 8.6K oversampled 8K video, and I do believe Canon's going to bump that up to 60 frames per second. However, this is going to require a whole lot more data throughput, and I think Canon can easily do that by simply taking the technology that they pioneered in the R3, that backside illuminated stack sensor, and put it in the R5. With the backside illuminated stack sensor, not only will it be able to do 8K 60 with great detail, but you're going to have better low light performance, better dynamic range, better ISO, and of course more detailed images and video. And I think that's going to be what stands the Mark II apart from the regular R5 that I'm shooting with right now. I think that backside illuminated stack sensor will just improve upon everything: the images, the low light performance, the dynamic range, the video detail, and that's what really, really matters. If we can produce better detailed video, if we can produce 8.6K oversampled 8K, it's going to be absolutely incredible. The dynamic range of this camera is going to improve too. I would really love to see dual CF Express cards, but let's face it, the R3 didn't get it, so I don't think the R5 Mark II will either. It will get a CF Express card, Type B, and it's going to get UHS 2 support. I don't see it supporting any other SD card formats. I can't see them going from 20 to 30 megapixels if it's lossless. If it's lossy, yes, I think they can definitely do 30 frames per second lossy. But as far as lossless, I think they can push it up to about maybe 24 frames per second, 22 frames per second. Keep in mind, the main limitation at this point is not the speed they can get out of the camera, but also the storage bottleneck. Right now, I think the fastest card, and I've got one down here, well, this is the card reader. It's an Angelbird CF Express AV Pro capable of 1,480 megabytes per second. Keeping in mind, the Nikon Z9 can shoot 20 frames per second lossless at 45.7 megapixels, and that's 1.2 gigabytes. So that still gives Canon an extra 300 gigabytes, and that 1.5 gigabytes per second, essentially, that's a minimum sustained write speed. So put that in the camera and that'll definitely be able to increase the frames per second, but also going from 45.7 to 50 is also going to increase bandwidth as well. So we'll just have to wait and see what Canon's going to be able to do in that camera. But what do you think? What do you think about the R5 Mark II? Do you think it's going to be a leapfrog over the R5? Do you think it's going to do something crazy like 16, 24, or 30K video? Now, I personally don't, but let me know what you think that the R5 Mark II is going to have in terms of capabilities. And we also know that the R1 is going to be coming out, I believe, before the R5 Mark II. Most likely a development announcement coming later this year in 2022 to be released in the first quarter or first half of 2023. The R5 is an incredible camera, and for me, the things that would get me to upgrade, to spend that extra money to upgrade to an R5 Mark II was, well, definitely better thermals for the video side of things, but also, and this is a big deal too, not just getting rid of that 30-minute record limit, but giving it a backside illuminated stacked sensor. The extra speed that we can get out of the camera, it translates into better detail for stills as well as video, gives us extra or better low light performance and ISO range. So I'm really looking forward to that. But that's it for now. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. And if you're interested in the R7, the R1, or the R5 Mark II, go ahead and subscribe and choose all notifications. So as soon as I release news, you're going to be in the know before anybody else. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you again soon. A dual pixel autofocus system, but it's much more accurate.